think you still think that the thing that people walk away from your workshops with is anything you say. At a workshop, the only thing they will remember is what they write down. And he was like, so your job is to get them to realize your thing in their voice. And I was like, oh, that is so interesting, and totally shifted my perspective.
Welcome to Amplify with Jess Ekstrom, a show designed to help women get out of their head and into their zone of influence. Today, we welcome Katie Quesada, keynote speaker and storytelling consultant. Katie has worked with brands like Zillow, United Healthcare, and American Eagle to ignite their story for more effective communication with their customers and their teams. Katie's own storytelling journey starts with something I'm all too familiar with. She lived in an RV with her husband for 2 years.
The only reason I could become a storytelling consultant is because we moved into the RV. So it's all one story that kind of opens with now my personal philosophy is that we need to collect stories over stuff. So that's kind of the opening. And I do a whole thing of like, now all of us are trying to find a product or a thing on freaking Amazon that's going to solve all our problems, but we actually just need better stories. And if we were to collect those stories and gather them, then we could get restoried, which is kind of the next part of the workshop. And the root word of restore is to restory something. So we need to actually start to think of ourselves as story collectors. And so I believe in stories over stuff. It's my life philosophy. I mean, obviously I now have a normal sized house and buy random junk. I'm not a perfect in any way. People ask me all the time, are you still a total minimalist? I'm like, no, my drawers have things in them. But I do have a filter that's probably stronger than maybe other people's filter for a bring home an item. But yeah, so it is definitely the opening of all of my keynotes actually in workshops.
Oh, stories over stuff. Love that. So talk to me about like how you became a storytelling consultant by living in an RV.
Yeah, well, I was at a job that things were going really south. And I was like, oh no, I need to quit this job. And my husband and I were like, but how will we do that? Because we lived in Los Angeles. And that's not a place where one income is easy peasy. So we were like, what's the plan here? And we had been saving for a house. And simultaneously, I had been at the job that I needed to quit. I had been sitting across a panel of women who were all different ages, ethnicities, diversity, like a very diverse panel of women. They'd been telling me their life story, and I'd been helping them say it in 6 minutes from the stage. So I did that over and over and over and over again. It was the nonprofit space. And I was like, oh, I think that's what I like to do, even though that was only 5% of my job. And I had been speaking regularly in that area. And I was like, I think I kind of want to do this. And as I was quitting my job, one of my friends said to me, oh, aren't you going to miss being a storytelling coach? And I was like, oh, maybe I'm a storytelling coach.
Yeah. You're like, do you think of me as that? Yeah.
Yes. I was like, I guess that maybe is what I'm doing. And then I quit, but we were like, how are we ever going to live while you launch a business and continue to save for a house, which we had been doing for 6 years. Like we had really been working hard. And it felt like, are we going to move back to my parents? Is it all going to go south? Or are we going to magically figure out a new way to live? And that was the RV. So we sold everything, moved into an RV. I had a second baby, and then we launched the business. And here we are 5 years later. How crazy is that?
Oh my goodness.
I know.
5 years. Because then, I think when we met, were just getting started, and then you came into Mic Drop Academy, one of our first ever cohorts. So thank you for being our guinea pig.
I loved being the pilot round. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, obviously, you do a lot of speaking, but you do something that I don't do, which is workshops. And, whenever we're in Mic Drop Workshop or Mic Drop Academy, and I'm teaching students like how to build their keynote, a lot of times someone who comes from like an educator background or trainings likes to get super technical. And it's like, well, this is what I want to teach them, 4 steps and activate this and do that. And I'm like, well, that's more of a workshop. So can you explain in your terms kind of the difference between keynotes and workshops? And then let's get into the how.
Totally. So a keynote is, in my mind, a 45-minute to 90-minute pristine, finished talk. And there is a bow on it, and it is one and done, and you get a lot of reps in it. And there's a lot of stuff about keynoting that is sexy. Like it is often high ticket. It's 1 hour. You fly in, you fly out. It's like, and you can do the same one over and over again. And all of that is great about keynoting. But in the keynoting space, your life is dependent upon event calendars, which is a very specific thing. So if you casually meet someone, they're not going to bring you in to do a keynote. Do you know what I mean? Like at their random work thing. So then I started I kind of was always like, oh, storytelling is a great keynote. And I had been doing some keynotes. But after a few of the original keynotes, I was like, oh, they had said to me, we want to figure out what our story is. And we want to like dive deeper into our story. And I said, sure. So I'll write you a workshop. So I started with a 90-minute workshop, then moved to a 2-hour workshop. And now my most common offering is a 3-hour workshop for corporate teams on communication and storytelling. And I do that virtually or in person, like 3 to 8 times a month, like a lot. That is like 40% of our business. And it's great because you can meet anyone at a networking event, at a party, on Instagram. And then they get to say to me, hey, we want to do this for our team. Our next available dates are this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one. And then I get to say, great, it works for me on this one. So there's a lot of opportunity there. And then it really is so fun to like see people workshop things. I really enjoy facilitating and workshopping. They get to like ask great questions and write down their own thing. And everyone ends with they each get a 1-minute story at the end of the workshop. So there's all these little like things that they get to kind of work it out. So both of them absolutely have their pros and cons, but workshopping, I think, is more of my sweet space. But there's so many wins to keynoting too. So
that's so interesting. Like one of the things that I'm like hearing you say this, I'm like, oh, maybe I don't like workshops as much as keynotes because I also have control issues and I like to know exactly how something is going to go. Because with a keynote, it's like you said, this is my signature talk and this is what I do and this is what I do well. With a workshop, it is you are not filling all the airtime, which I think is another really important thing that you taught me about this, where it's like 3 hours seems like how the heck will I fill that space?
yes.
And you say, you don't. You guide them
Yes.
and they help you fill that space.
Yes. And so one of the really interesting gifts I was given is that when I was living in the RV and I was trying to launch this company, but my husband was still working at the time for another company. Now he works for our organization. But at the time we were like, how are we going to make enough money? I was saying yes to everything. I was in the 100% yes phase. And a guy hired me to lead his corporate workshops. So I flew all over the country, like 6 or 7 times to different corporate teams. And I had to lead either a 4 or 8-hour workshop, which is so dumb because to this day, I led those and I was like, this is the worst learning module of all time. 0 people want to learn something for 8 hours. I don't care who you are and I don't care how good it is. It's like people asking me to do a 4-hour virtual event. And I'm like, oh, that's so nice, but no one wants that.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
So like the answer is just generally no. And so I got to kind of learn and try on his content and then shift his content. And then one of his mentors I got to meet with, and he said to me, which changed me forever. He said, oh, Katie, I think you still think that the thing that people walk away from your workshops with is anything you say. At a workshop, the only thing they will remember is what they write down. So your job, yes. And this guy had made millions of dollars on corporate workshops. And he was like, so your job is to get them to realize your thing in their voice. And I was like, oh, that is so interesting.
Yeah.
And totally shifted my perspective. Yeah.
And I would say that's not so far off from a keynote, even though a keynote might seem more one directional. They're not going to remember what I say. They're going to remember like what they thought.
Yes.
And how their beliefs and actions changed from what I said.
Right. It's their part of the story. It's when yours and theirs kind of interacts. So so there's way more. In a 3-hour workshop, I'm only teaching for about 90 minutes. And so it's way more of like, turn to your neighbor, write this thing down, draw your story map, figure out these questions, write your 1-minute story, stand up, decide what your storytelling issues are. And then they get to, share funny things like, I never realized that I give way too much context in my storytelling and bore everyone. And everyone claps. You're like, yay. Like, and you all get to share their like fun, self-assessed, pain points in storytelling, which makes it easier too. But that's what makes workshopping fun.
And so we just did a mic drop workforce training for the Falcons, which is like what we are working on for like a B2B with mic drop. Like, how do we help women speak confidently at work? And so I did step out of my comfort zone and do a workshop. And I think one of the other aftermaths that I didn't realize from doing workshops was the team bonding experience from that. So not just like the individual growth that comes from a workshop, but seeing other people stand up, like share something, write something is like, oh, they all now feel more connected. So we've partnered with you on a course building your workshop, and you can go to micdropworkshop.com/series and look at Katie's course. I learned a lot from it. I'm not going to lie. I went through it before I did this Falcons training because I was like, I feel like I'm too, what am I going to say? How do I be motivational instead of how do I help them come to their own conclusions, which is what you're saying to do. But just for ideation, someone who's listening that's like, oh, what would my workshop be? What kind of tips or advice would you start with in guiding them in that?
The first thing I would do is, come up with, you might have a transformation promise from Mic Drop or like a key idea. That transformation project, promise,
project, promise, whichever one. Yeah, they both work.
Long. Yes, yeah. That transformation promise, that is your core idea. And that core idea does need to have ROI for that team. And that's something that's really important because for a lot of us, especially in the speaker space, it's like I speak on confidence in enlightenment. And you're like, that's great, but what is the corporate ROI? So I need you to say back to me, when your team speaks more confidently, they will land more sales and your company will continue to grow. So having that kind of ROI is really key, especially from, I speak of something very nebulous, storytelling. It's like, whatever, what's that? And then afterwards they're like, oh, wow, we need to keep doing this. And now I have 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. They see it afterwards. But before, you need to be able to kind of sell that and say that.
You need to tell them why it matters. Yeah, exactly. That's your job, not their job to figure out. Yeah. So for anyone who isn't in Mic Drop Workshop, a transformation promise, what it is, it's a fill in the blank. After people hear me speak, they will blank. What do you want them to believe and achieve after hearing you? Because my speech will blank. What are the stories you're going to tell, tactics you're going to use, lessons you want to teach? This is essentially your North Star, not just for your speaking career, but like thought leadership in general, whether keynotes, workshops, podcasts, all of it. You do a lot with speaking, training. You have your own courses and you have this North Star for you. And you've really picked up momentum. I've just been seeing you crush it. What do you credit that to?
Super thankfully, word of mouth. I feel very grateful for that, but that's how the whole thing has grown, is that like teams tell teams who tell teams. One thing that I started doing about 6 months ago that really helped is I have very strategic feedback forms. And you've talked about this a little bit in Speaker Sisters, but like Talkadot, I've used Talkadot once for a keynote, but mostly it's my own Google form. That's the last slide. And like 6 or 8 months ago, I started to say, you can't leave the workshop until you finish these 6 questions. And it's like a testimonial. You rate it, why it changed you, what you learned, what you're going to take away. And that is gold. Like for a C-suite person to get an email from my team that says like, here's what your team said. Like, this was life-changing, best training I've ever attended. Like, that kind of feedback, I used to literally just leave.
Yeah,
I used to be like, too. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and then, job well done. Yeah.
Yes. And then like a week later, I'd be like, I wonder if they liked that. And I just say, and now I have like and then I also learn from that feedback. There are people who, give me good feedback and I'm like, oh, I've been tweaking. So I think that that's also super helpful, but I really do think, and then on the feedback form, this was kind of an idea I got from Mic Drop that you suggest. But one of the questions is, do you know someone who would like this workshop? Which I had never in my life asked for a referral before Mic Drop. Ever. Like I never done any of this. Like the whole thing just happened to keep working. But Mic Drop was like, here's some really strategic things you can do to make this make more sense. So now that's on there. So then my team can follow up afterwards. There's little things that kind of continue to build momentum as you go.
It's crazy how like little we think about asking people for what we need. And we have a like human desire to want to help each other. Like, we want to help. I want you to tell me what your goals are, who you're looking to talk to, and see if I can be a connector. Like, but the fact that we're like, well, I don't want to seem too pushy or salesy or whatever. It's like, no, ask people where they get, like, show them where they can help you. They're not like sitting around wondering like, how can I make Katie's day better?
Exactly.
Like, or how can I get Jess more money? Like, it's like, no, show them where you can help them. And that's something we teach in Mic Drop because it was something I didn't do for so long. But I do want to give some tips around storytelling because since you are the expert, I think one of the things that has become increasingly more important these days is brevity. And we see this a lot, just like in Mic Drop. It's like, well, if I'm going to share my story or if I'm going to share about me, whether it's on my LinkedIn or in conversation, it's like, well, I have to tell them everything. I have to like beginning, middle, and end, arc, this, that. But how do we know we'll lose people's attention? I actually saw it was like a TikTok about it was called like the dopamine swipe or something that's happening now, where we are so used to being able to swipe out of things that don't interest us on our phone that we check out of conversations that much quicker
Wow.
because we in our head are like, swipe out, even though it's a real life conversation. And so it's harder to keep people's attention. What kind of tips or frameworks do you have for someone in relation to brevity of telling like, oh, so tell me about you, like, which is a
Totally.
dreaded question. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I mean, so much of it is like, who is the audience? What do they care about? And what do they value? So before we start with your thing, we have to actually just take a second and say, oh,
What's their thing?
what's their thing?
Yeah.
Which is always really, that people are like, wait, what? And like, no, we actually do have to start with that because then we'll craft a better story. So we need to think about who that audience is. So that's always where you begin, is actually who you're talking to, not what you're talking about. Because that will answer a lot of the questions. Like, how much time do they have? Are they reading this? I talk in my workshop about said versus read. Some things should be said and other things should be read. And you should not be reading your bio out loud. Like, this is not, you need to be telling me a compelling story. So those are two kind of different frameworks to think of. There's a bunch of different frameworks that I go through in the work that I do and in my course. I have a course called Story School. But in this like general idea of creating brevity, I usually do the 3 C's: context, conflict, and conclusion. And every micro story that you're ever going to tell about yourself and who you are has to have those 3 things. It needs to have the context. What's going on? Who's there? It needs to have the conflict. What was I worried about? What almost went wrong? What was big? What was the inciting incident? What did I fear? What happened? And then conclusion. How do I land the plane? How do I wrap this? What did I learn? Now I can see. Then I saw. Now we can, conclusive statements. So any story that you're going to tell needs to have those 3 things, but it needs to be short. So, I mean, famously, Mark Twain said the shortest story ever written is "For sale, baby shoes, never worn." The whole, like, that's 6 words. Okay. 6 words is the shortest story ever written. And it has context, conflict, and conclusion. And that like piece, we have to really cut it down. Here's the thing. A lot of us are desiring so much to be understood that we tend to over-explain. Because we want to be understood, we over-explain. But I have a theory that actually curiosity trumps boredom every time. So keeping someone curious is much more effective than telling them everything. So when you can create curiosity, make someone wonder. You don't need to tell them everything. They're allowed to ask questions. That's okay. So a lot of us think, okay, how do I tell them everything they need to know and want to know about me and my whole life forever? And, those are what our brain is doing. But instead, just even say, hey, I'm from this place. And one time I jumped out of an airplane and then I got a job at Google. That is more interesting to me than if you were to read to me your resume. So now I get to ask follow-up questions. Whoa, when did you do that? How was your time at Google? So that creates curiosity as opposed to drowning us in data.
I mean, we have all witnessed it. Like, we've been in the audience where there's a panel and the person who is talking for 10 minutes straight, answering every corner of it, you're like, okay, get to the point, or like, we're good. And then the person who gives the briefest yet strongest answer, you're like, I want them to talk more. And so it's like, when you think about your preferences as an audience member, like, and how you can adapt those to how you storytell or how you speak, it's like, yeah, I don't need to hear your full story, but give me the headlines and show me like where I can follow up, or how, and people are inherently selfish, how it relates to me and what, and so I think the curiosity over boredom is super interesting. And I think it especially also when it comes to, we right now in Mic Drop Academy, we're in our spring cohort and we're writing our abstracts. It's like, you don't need to tell them everything that's going to happen in this talk.
Exactly.
You need to make them interested in what's going to
Yes.
happen in this talk.
Yes. And what I see people do accidentally a lot is do timestamps. So like, in 1997, and then in 2004, and then in 2014, and then in 2022, and then in 2020, and they're basically reading a chronological timeline. And that is the quickest way to lose people. People are like, okay, when does it get good? And they don't know. And all of those pieces to the puzzle, so when you start to do that, you can really start to say, okay, wait, stop. What do they want to know? What's the best part? What's the most compelling part? What's the hook? And kind of jumping to that is helpful.
It's like someone who, when my husband does this, and he doesn't care if I call him out, but it's like, he'll be telling a story that's like, yeah, it was on Tuesday. Yeah. Or was it exactly Wednesday? And I'm like, holy crap, just get to the point. Is this a relevant part of the story? And so it's like, well, if you don't enjoy being on that end, then consider that when you tell stories. Katie, you are amazing. Definitely check out our course together, micdropworkshop.com/series if you want to start building your workshop. But where else can people find you to join your storytelling courses, book you to speak, all of those things?
KatieQuesada.com. Katie Quesada is my Instagram handle, and Quesada is Quesada, quesadilla. And those are all my handles. Like everything is just Katie Quesada, my name. It's clean. Website, Instagram, all the things. But I'm so excited to have partnered with you, Jess. And I feel so excited for a lot of the Mic Drop ladies who have a keynote, but they want to make it practical. And that opens twice as many speaking opportunities.
Widens the net for sure.
Even for smaller businesses and for anyone I feel like my first 10 workshops were people I somehow knew.
Yeah.
And that's when you can really get your reps in for your brother's uncle's dental team, and like, that's great. Go do a workshop for them, get those reps in. And that
because they're not probably having an annual conference with their 6 hygienists.
Exactly.
But they need to learn storytelling or how to talk to patients and all of that. So having a workshop really widens your net of opportunities to get in and speak and facilitate. So you've inspired me in that. I guess I want to end with, what is, a lot of people who are listening are maybe just getting started in the thought leadership space.
Yeah.
One piece of advice you have for them.
You would be surprised how little people know about your thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's, we all think like, I know of a bunch of storytelling experts above me, a bunch who are like, these people have multiple books. They're the real storytelling experts. These people are like, have given 12 TED Talks, and those are the real. And then I'm like, oh, wait, but I actually do know a lot about this thing and lead a lot of workshops on it. And I know a lot. I think there's a lot of people who really underestimate how much they know because they think other people know a lot about that thing when other people don't. And like, you're allowed to be an expert in your field, and you actually can guide people towards new revelations in a really cool way, even if you only know 40% more than them, 30% more than them, 10% more than them. Like it's more than them. And that is a really helpful thing to remember, because a lot of us are waiting to like, I don't know, maybe I have felt like that where I'm like, oh, well, okay, maybe I'll be an expert in this when I have 3 books, 2 TED Talks, and a show on whatever. And I don't have any of that, but I get to lead workshops at really cool brands. And
very cool brands. Some of them we're not even allowed to name because you had to sign an NDA, which is so cool. I wish I could name it, but it was
Me
big.
Too. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Katie, thank you so much. You're the best.
Thanks, Jess. I so appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Amplify. If you are a fan of the show, show us some podcast love by giving us a rating and review. And give us a follow at Mic Drop Workshop and at Jess Ekstrom. This episode was edited and produced by Earfluence, and I'm Jess Ekstrom, your host. Remember that you deserve the biggest stage, so let's find out how to get you there. I'll see you again soon.